Hello and welcome to our 2018 SMAANZ webinar. My name is Dr. Ashley Thompson and I'm a member of the SMAANZ board and today's webinar host. I'll soon hand over to our presenters, but before we begin, I wanted to say a few words about SMAANZ and the webinar series. So SMAANZ, or the Sport Management Association of Australia and New Zealand, is an academic association, and we're aimed at encouraging scholarly research in sport management and to provide platforms through which this information and knowledge can be shared. We engage with our membership through our conference, which is held annually in November in popular parts of Australia and New Zealand, and through our academic journal, the Sport Management Review. The conference for this year will be hosted by the University of South Australia in picturesque Adelaide, so we invite you to join us at a conference soon. We also encourage you to connect with us via Twitter using the @SportScholars handle or the SMAANZ hashtag, or via LinkedIn. And there's also a link to membership information displayed on the slide. Now, through the SMAANZ webinars, we aim to engage with the SMAANZ community virtually outside of our annual conference to promote and encourage interactive scholarly inquiry related to relevant sport management issues, and also to provide support for our participants to develop new knowledge and capabilities. Today's webinar considers the important area of enhancing the teaching of sport management. And we're very fortunate that it's going to be presented by two experts, Dr. Marlene Dixon from Texas A&M and Dr. Emily Dane-Staples from St. John Fisher College, both from the US. Now, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post these as you think of them. That ensures that we have time to answer your questions within our webinar time slot. We'll endeavour to have an opportunity for questions midway through and then again at the end of the presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the question text box, type your question, and press send. Now, to create greater personal engagement among our participants, I'll use your name when posing questions to the presenters. However, if you'd prefer to remain anonymous, please just type a "non" at the end of your question. At this point, I'll hand over to Marlene and Emily to lead you through the presentation. And I'll join you again to assist with asking questions throughout the presentation. I'd like to thank Marlene and Emily for kindly presenting our SMAANZ webinar today, and I'm sure that we're all looking forward to their presentation.
Thanks, everybody. We're excited to have you along. This is Marlene Dixon, speaking for myself and Emily here in the US, and we're excited for today's presentation. Next slide. In today's webinar, we're going to outline some applicable learning theories. We're going to explore the application of these theories in a sport management setting. Third, we're actually going to address the common concerns with regard to the next generation learner. And then we're going to talk about ideas for application and extension of learning outside the classroom. Some of our thoughts today are based on the articles you can see there on the slide if you would like to read them in more depth. And then Emily has additional research that she's done in this area if you want to contact her. And I have a number of case studies and other things that may be of help to you when we get to the end. My research focus is primarily on sport and life quality, although I have delved a lot into the sport for development realm of late. And some of the presentations that you may want resources later is some case studies in finance and human resource management, an assignment called I've Always Wondered, which I stole from Brian Mills at University of Florida. And so I give him credit for that, and he could tell you more how he uses it as well as the DISC leadership profile, which we utilize through athlete assessments there in, I believe it's called Mooloolaba. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And then also some ideas for field trips and practical experiences.
Hello, everybody. You can go to my slide, I guess. This is Emily. I'm in St. John Fisher College, which is in Rochester, New York, so just south of Toronto across Lake Ontario in the very northern part of the US. And I'm at a very different institution. I'm at a very small liberal arts private school and knew from early on that I wanted to be involved in teaching. And so that's really where I have spent most of my work. Similar to Marlene, there's any of those selected teaching presentations, if they sound of interest to you, feel free to contact me offline and we can sort of dialogue about what those might be and what those could potentially do to enhance your classroom. But let's get to the focus for today. The next slide, please. And you've seen our title several times now, and I really want to focus on the subtitle there. And the really important thing to understand is that you really want to consider all four of these variables. When we're getting ready to do a class, we think about how am I going to deliver that content with maybe a little bit of consideration to the student and maybe not so much with the environment. But we know that if we have great instruction and engaged students, but a very, very warm room, we're not going to get the learning outcomes that we were hoping for. And if we have a great environment, but our content's too dense, again, we're going to have our learning outcomes suffer. So we want to encourage consideration of all four variables throughout this presentation, which begins with the basic context of understanding, which Marlene is going to talk about.
As we all know, the current context of education and sport is a very high pressure to remain relevant and effective. And the rapid changes in information and technology, both in education and in the sport context, leave us with a situation where it is impossible to disseminate a fixed body of knowledge that we can equip students with that are going to last them their entire sport careers. In fact, that would last them for the first 2 or 3 years of their sport career. And therefore, we are left with the challenge that we need to see education, we need to see learning as a way to help students learn how to learn, to solve problems on their own, to be innovative and creative, so that they can be active, independent learners, not sponges, receivers of knowledge as we stand in our 200 people lectures and try to get them to digest information. But the focus is on helping them digest that information for themselves and learn to think and create and solve problems that are beyond the classroom. Therefore, we have lent heavily from a constructivism approach when we think about reshaping and reframing the sport management classroom. And the constructivism approach basically suggests that learning is an ongoing process of adaptation in a complex, multifaceted, continuous process of change that takes place within the evolving landscape of activity. And as you can see, this quote, this definition, hits on many of the aspects that Emily suggested, that we need to pay attention to the learner, the environment, the content, and the context. There's two sides of constructivism that inform the way that we design and our learning activities and our learning philosophy. The first is psychological constructivism, which basically suggests that each person brings a life history and experience into contact with situated learning opportunities that shape and transform the learner. And essentially what this means is that, from one perspective, this means that we need to adapt our learning activities, our learning goals, to what people bring to the environment. So everybody comes with a different background, and we need to figure out what do they already know, what do they already know how to do, and how can we equip them with things that they don't know how to do so that they can advance in their learning. If we couple that with social constructivism, it essentially says that we then join in groups and everybody brings together their individual backgrounds. And therefore, we learn as a social process, both knowledge and culture, so that we don't just arrive at solutions, but we also figure out even how to approach solutions And as we have seen in our sport management classrooms and out in industry, that the way I approach a problem may be very different from the way that you approach a problem, not just the answer that we get at, but the way that we even arrive at it. And therefore, it brings value to working together, not just because we come up with more ideas, but we also come up with brand new ways of thinking about ideas. And I just wanted to share with you a short example to kind of bring this home. And one was, you saw in the previous slide, a lot of work that we're doing with our friends in Kenya. And I so value their approach to things and their the way that they think about things, because I seem to think about things very often in a linear fashion. We do this and this and this and this. And they seem to think about things much more in a circular and in a global fashion, where things don't have to exactly line up. They can fall together in various pieces. And so you can see where, just from this one example, their approach to things and my approach to things can arrive at very different solutions, not just because we're thinking about the end goal, but because we're actually thinking about the process differently. And therefore, if we bring together a constructivist approach, both psychologically and sociologically, we can enhance the learning of our students and give them, equip them for working out in a world that they are also going to encounter different ideas and different backgrounds. In sum, when we look at these theories, they suggest we must be learner rather than teacher-centered. We must focus on process as well as outcomes. We need to tend to difference in student learning styles and backgrounds. And we need to think about the communities of learning and the communities of practice in which we embed our content. So we need to create opportunities for students to gradually move from educational communities and simply learning communities into communities of practice, which may include everything from introductory type of assignments where they're just contacting an expert in the field, all the way through internships, through actual practice. I think, Ashley, we were going to stop and take any questions if we had at this point.
Yeah, so there's a question here, and it may be coming up later on, so I'll put it out there, and if so, we can sort of tag it and come back to it. But you did sort of mention the group aspect there, and sort of that whole social process and that sharing of kind of knowledge by having those different viewpoints and things. Do you have any perspectives on the best way to construct a group in a sport management classroom to kind of achieve some of those outcomes?
Okay. Oh, that is a great question, and I think Emily will have some insights here as well. And we'll tackle this here, and then we can do again at the end if there's more questions. But I have found that I use a variety of methods. One is to put them in intentional groups if I know enough about the students ahead of time, in order to put them in intentional groups where, say, for example, in a graduate seminar, in a graduate finance seminar, I will intentionally put people in groups that may be a mixed abilities or mixed backgrounds, where I have someone in the group that has a very strong finance background and someone who doesn't know a lot, and so that therefore they can, share knowledge and help each other. But I've also found it helpful to let students choose their groups. But in the course of a semester, I'll use a mix of things, because if I just let them pick groups, they always pick the same groups, which sort of defeats the purpose. And if I assign groups, then they feel that that's contrived. And so I try to actually use a mix of things and be very intentional about that. And then I think the final thing I would say about that is that I have found that groups need accountability. And I have found that having feedback, that group members providing feedback about their own and each other's contributions not just evaluative feedback like I did everything and they did nothing, but actually asking them to think about what was this person's approach to the problem and how is that helpful? What was group person B? What was their approach to the solution and how is that helpful? And so I asked them to reflect on the contributions in process and not just in quantity.
I guess what I would add to that is it really depends on what your learning outcomes want to be. I mean, if you want some of your learning outcomes to be the sort of increased communication skills, how to resolve conflicts, those types of things alongside the content development, then you're really talking about team-based learning. And team-based learning happens in consistent teams throughout the course of a semester with very carefully scaffolded assignments and very different kinds of interaction between instructor and student to student, both intra and intergroup work. So I think you have to consider what is the goal of your group work? Is it just to increase, brain power or to socially engage with lots of different kinds of people? In that sense, yes, you're probably going to be varying your group structures on a fairly consistent basis, doing some of the techniques that Marlene had suggested. But if you're really getting into, I want long-term development of those more soft skills within group dynamics, then you're going to be much more intentional. It's actually probably in the literature shows it's much better to have a consistent group throughout an entire semester.
Great, thanks Emily and Marlene for your responses to that particular question. I think we'll carry on with the presentation now and look to come back to questions again at the end. So we'll hand over to you, Emily, now to carry on with the webinar.
Sounds good. So Marlene's first suggestion of being learner-centered is really, I think, where I want to start here. And I use net generation in quotes here because there are sort of formal definitions with birth years, kind of like your Gen X, Gen Y, and millennials. But I like to think about students as sort of a web browser with 15 tabs open in their brain, that they're updating all the time and they've got such a different focus and such a different pull that any one of those things can be interfering with your learning episode. So we have on our campus a real concern for many students who are food insecure. We are a fairly expensive private school, and so they're on limited meal plans and having to wonder, which 2 times am I going to eat today? That's a major concern of what's going on in their mind as they're trying to get through their days. We have lots of mental health issues in society today. We have lots of students who are both full-time workers and full-time students. So there's a lot of things going on in the brains of our students. We have common complaints that, they don't read. Well, why? Why is it that they don't read? Do they not read because nobody's ever taught them how to critically read a text? Are they not reading because in all of the things that they're juggling, it's not a priority to something else? We have complaints or concerns that they're on their phone all the time. Well, how can we use that to our advantage? How can we take their natural inclinations and really work to make our classrooms even better? And ultimately, what we want to do for these learning episodes is be able to, close some of those browser tabs so they have minimal distractions. And we really get them to do that by trying to manage what their cognitive load is. And there are 3 main parts to the cognitive load. That germane load that I talk about first is really the foundation. So a lot of the stuff that you set up before your semester even begins, the syllabus, the policies that you're going to enact, how you're choosing which content to include, all of those things lay the strong foundation and the expectations for what students are going to be doing on a day-to-day basis. The second part of the cognitive load is that intrinsic load, so what they're being asked to do in the moment. So it's as the learning episode is progressing, is it lecture, is it small group work, is it discussion, what is the material that you're asking them to work with. And then there's that third piece, the extraneous load, the stuff that gets in the way, the stuff that, they keep going to that different browser tab in their brain, or the classroom is too noisy, or there's an errant mark on your projection screen, or any of those things that interfere with that. And so our job as instructors is to help manage that cognitive load with them. We want to maximize that solid foundation. We want to effectively manage what's in that middle, and then do our best in ways that we can to minimize that extraneous load. So how do we actually do that? Well, things to consider when you're trying to lay a good foundation is picking your dates in context. Most, whether you're on a quarter system or semesters or trimesters, you have a solid midpoint. Most everybody has to adhere to that same midpoint. You know that students are going to be much more taxed at that point in time. Can you avoid those? What are the baseline student skills that you're working with? Is this a class that's for upperclassmen and you can expect that they would have taken 4 things coming in, and so you know you can build on that existing foundation? Or is this a bunch of first semester students who really are still getting their feet wet all the way around? The progression of the course development. How much time are you spending on each concept? Not every concept needs the same number of learning episodes, and it's through trial and error you figure this stuff out, but it's very important. I also mentioned textbook selection because it's one of the first introductions to the course that students have before they even set foot in the classroom or meet you. When they order that book or they go online and they get a 500-page, very, very heavy hardbound, that immediately starts to have them thinking about what they're going to have to do in that class. Not saying to avoid 500-page books, but know that that's impacting what they think they're going to be tasked on doing. So thinking about the intrinsic load, what is that prior knowledge that you uncovered they have versus what do they actually need? And of course, you're trying for, with this and the complexity, to find that Goldilocks spot. It's not too hard, it's not too easy, it's right there in the middle so that they don't go into cognitive overload. And that also triggers into what things are you asking them to do at any one time? Are they being asked to learn information and apply it while also talking to friends and making some good notes? That's a lot to have to do well at a single time. And the extraneous load, again, there's not a lot that you can do for stuff that's happening in your students' lives, but there are some things that you can control. So the classroom conditions, can you work with your facilities department if there are problems there that can be addressed? What do your slide designs look like? Are you overwhelming them with what you're presenting to them? I'll talk about that a little bit more. Again, the calendar impact, sometimes people are just going to be sluggish. It happens to be that point in the semester, and we all have had those. And also the classroom climate. Are you working with a group of students who have never interacted with each other before, and so they're very shy and they're very nervous? They're fearful of, making a mistake, or they're concerned about the impression and the reputation? Or is this a group of students who are, in their 4th year together? They're very familiar with each other. They know how to interact with each other. All of those things can impact that cognitive load that you're worried about. And so really, when it comes to what you can control, you want to make sure that you're maximizing things that go along with the way their brain likes to process information. And the best way to understand that is the dual processing theory. This essentially states, in this sort of generic model, that we have 2 channels in our brains to use, one that's the nonverbal and one that's the verbal. So if you think about, watching a movie, whatever, if you're watching it on mute, you're only using the picture or the visual to guide you along. If you have, the words or the dialogue track, you can add that into what's going on, and vice versa. And you know that you're going to be more scared in the horror movie when you've got both the picture and the sound working together, because our brain makes those connections and integrations between what we're actually seeing. So as we start to get to the end of the movie and we say, oh, this was good, this was bad, I liked it better than this other one, that's where this knowledge transfer happens, and we start to bring things back from our long-term memory and connect with our new knowledge to our old knowledge. And so this is essentially what we're doing in our learning episodes, is we're trying to present effective information using both of these channels so that they can make connections and add to their existing knowledge and their schemas in their brains. So this is ideal. But sometimes we overload our students. I'm absolutely guilty of this. So this is a slide that came from an older class of mine that is an example of overloading our dual processing theory. So the visuals that students are presented with is both words and pictures. And as they're starting to make connections here, they're wondering, does each bullet go with each picture? Which thing goes where? While also trying to listen to our our sort of script as we're speaking to them. Oh, and by the way, we're probably hoping they take notes. So as you can see, very quickly, they go into cognitive overload, right? They're having to verbally process both the written words and the spoken words while also trying to integrate these pictures. And doing too many of those things has them losing information. They're not as able to make connections and integrations to what they're seeing. And if they're not doing that effectively, they're not going to be able to access their prior knowledge in a really great way. It's going to be minimized because of that overload. So how do we manage what we're giving them as stimuli? Well, the first thing to consider is that nonverbal track. Are your visuals relevant? Do they matter? If you've just added a clip art piece because your slide looked boring, well, students are going to have to waste cognitive energy to figure out, does that matter or doesn't it matter? And when they realize it doesn't matter, they're going to dismiss it. Well, that's a waste of their cognitive energy. So is it relevant and needed to put there? Are your visuals understandable? We may need to put, complex graphics up there. Have you cued them by some way to know what information to look at or where to start comprehending the visual? The text-heavy slides, we'll talk a little bit more about that, a little later. And the visuals are the same as your script. This essentially verbatim reading of slides. Research has shown that this is a really ineffective mechanism to do, because you're actually not using two channels effectively. The two channels are doing the same thing, and so it's not actually adding to the overall knowledge base. So with your words, does your script acknowledge your student baselines? Again, thinking about those baseline skills that student came in with, be careful that you're not talking over their head. Are you speaking and using language that they're not comfortable with or they're not understanding? That's going to immediately impact the learning episode. Does your script complement the visuals? Again, one shouldn't be able to be used without the other. They need to work together. And does your script articulate a cohesive story? We like order in our own minds. We're looking for a logical sequence that makes sense. So let's talk about underutilizing our theories here. So again, a typical slide, very, very text heavy. There's no visual component to this whatsoever. So essentially, we're underutilizing our dual processing theory because there's nothing for that second channel to be doing. It's essentially just sort of sitting there. It's looking for a visual to try to understand, and it's not there, right? This also leads to problems in our knowledge transfer because that channel is being wasted and our verbal processing is still being overwhelmed because we're trying to listen and read at the same time. We're missing it. And so our brain has two channels, but we're not using them. So how do we fix this? So this is a slide that might be a better approach to effectively utilizing both channels. So there are words on the screen, but the words here are the conclusion. Despite a few similarities, minority groups experience society and sport differently. So that is immediately a cue to students. What am I supposed to be listening to? What am I supposed to be attending to? They're not left guessing, they know. And then they see from the visual, I can now understand which minority groups we're talking about. And I can see the similarities by the red mark in the middle that I see it's going to overlap. And so this way, we're not overwhelming either two of those channels, and they're effectively working together without being overloaded, and so they can see how these things progress. So maximizing this dual processing theory really requires you to work through the entire diagram. So not just designing good stimuli, but also how to facilitate those connections and integrations so that students can take both their new knowledge and integrate it into their existing knowledge. So one of the things that I utilize to deal with this part of the dual processing is the ICAP framework. And the ICAP framework talks about the level of interaction that students are having with the information. And as Marlene mentioned before, what we want to avoid is that passivity, right? If they don't have to do anything with the information, they're not likely to make accurate connections and integrations, and they don't have to connect it to anything in their working memory. which is not going to lead to the learning outcomes that we ultimately want. And so what we really want to get to is these other 3 levels of the framework, where we're asking students to be active in manipulating or selecting and attending to certain pieces of information, asking them to be constructive about what it means, how it can be worked with other things, and actually interacting in a defending or dialoguing way where they have to take the new information and work with it, manipulate it in some way, shape, or form. And one of the best ways I've used this as my own planning to sort of help students make those connections and integrations is by the race questioning hierarchy. And this ties into some of the stuff that Marlene talked to earlier. The race question hierarchy is a scaffold of questions that ask students to get active with the information. So Marlene talked about the psychological constructivism and students having their own experiences and their own perspectives. Well, that's what the H, the history, is all about, relating to student experiences. So you're in a classroom and you ask a student, when has this ever happened to you? You've been at a sporting event. What was an example of poor customer service that you experienced? Well, they immediately have to go into their long-term memory, select a relevant event, and bring it back to the present and talk about it. And in their selection of that, your feedback can correct them, tweak them. Maybe they picked the wrong memory. Maybe they were focusing on the wrong part of the lesson. But by forcing them to actively engage with that, you have those learning opportunities as an instructor to make sure they're making accurate connections and integrations of the current to the old knowledge. So relationships, questions that engage in those comparisons. You know, how does this compare to, this is what we know in football, but what is it like in netball? We know what this is like for women, but what is it like for men? This application of new knowledge and context, what could this solution solve? What evidence do we have to support? So taking those and applying it in those new contexts. The speculation, what would happen if you changed? What would be the potential problems of if we did this, what could happen next? So thinking about those consequences, all of those things get to an activation of student work. And when we think about how to make connections with them, we really do need to revisit cognitive load in a lot of ways, because not all tasks for integration are the same complexity. And this is one of the best tools that I have found to consider, what am I asking students to do, and is it too much? So this is the active learning inventory tool, and it comes actually from the pharmaceutical education curriculum and research, but is really broadly applicable across a lot of ways. Essentially, this says that anything on this tool is a strategy for active learning. It gets students out of that passive role. But depending on who you're working with, the type of students, the point in a content development, and or the point in a semester development, you can pick different complexity tasks. So very low and easy things that you can do, the 1-minute paper, you know, the Q&A that we think about, all of those things. The brain dump or the free write I've done oftentimes to sort of help deal with the extraneous load factors, asking students when they come in, I just want you to write down everything that you're worried about right now, everything that's on your mind and you considered it. And we sort of do a metaphorical, write it down, purge it out, fold it up, put it away, and it sort of frees them a little bit from those other burdens. It has nothing to do with content, but it helps to manage the load in context. So all of these things going up to the high complexity tasks are options for pretty much any content area that you want to be focused on. And Marlene's going to talk a little bit more about how to utilize some of these teaching tools in context.
Great, thanks, Emily. So we will pass over to Marlene now to discuss how we might put some of these in context.
Okay, great. Ashley, did we have any questions that we wanted to answer based on Emily's material before I get to this, or do you want me to jump right in?
I think if you just jump right in and then we can come back to questions at the end, if that's okay.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so again, I had, just to give you a little context, I've taught in a number of situations, everything from small undergraduate to large undergraduate lectures to, you know, 5-person PhD seminar. So I just appreciated what you said, Emily, that so much of what we do has to do with the context of our learning and the context of the classroom itself. So please understand that this isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. These are just a couple ideas that I've used in the past, and Emily will add some of hers in the Q&A that will give you some examples of high complexity and medium complexity active learning to put in practice some of the principles we've been talking about. Probably for me, one of the very first and foremost applications that I utilize is case studies. And I love case studies because they're problem-based learning, but you can do them in the classroom. And so you don't have to go out and necessarily find a problem to solve. There's organizations out there with lots and lots of problems to solve. And we can have an opportunity to play with them just as other people have done. And I think I should have put this first. The very first thing I find in case studies is they have to be realistic. When the case studies are contrived, students are not engaged and they think it's dumb. And if we think it's dumb, guess what? They're going to think it's dumb. And so they have to be realistic. So be very specific in choosing the case that you do and be very picky in choosing a case that actually is realistic. And the ones that are based on real problems as opposed to just written for classroom use, I find are the best. The second thing I would say is that students have to have a sufficient background to feel capable. If you give them a case study that they are not equipped to handle, you find that you don't get very good solutions and that students are frustrated. And I guess I speak specifically toward finance. If you don't have the financial tools and the financial background to do the analysis that the case study is asking you to do, then you can't do that. But it also provides a great opportunity for students to come to you and say, hey, we don't know how to do this, or for you to find out what they do know, and then you can fill in the gaps in the classroom. The third thing is that in the groups, they bring together various backgrounds and knowledge, and so you can tap into some of the social constructivism that we talked about earlier. And then finally, the opportunity for feedback and discussion, to me, that is something I'm still crafting, and to get beyond questions that simply say, any questions? Or what did you think? Or how did you solve that? And so to use the model that Emily just introduced in terms of levels of questions and abilities and connections, if you could create yourself a list of 1,000 different ways to ask, what do you think, or what did you do, and why did you do that, provides opportunities for all those levels of learning for the students as they tackle the case study within the classroom. The second brief example I'll give you, if you want to go to the next slide, is to move towards this idea of communities of practice. And to me, it's over the lifetime, the learning career of a student, that we gradually extend the classroom. So again, this is being aware of your environment, being aware of student backgrounds. Is this an introductory level course where students don't have any networks or any knowledge of the sport industry? Or is this a capstone master's level course where they're ready to head out to their internship and they should already have built some connections and some industry knowledge? So of course we want to do internships, of course we want to do service learning, but are there other things that we could build toward those? And that's why I didn't necessarily go into internships and service learning. I think those are sort of the ultimate goal. But in the interim, for us that can't always do those things in our classroom, in our context, a couple things as steps. First of all, I've introduced career interviews and into introductory sport management classes, where one of their assignments was actually to go interview somebody that works in sport, and it's typically broadly defined. Anyone, you can't be related to them. and you can't have worked for them previously, but that taps into not only what did they learn about the career, but also tacit knowledge, like how do you actually make a connection? What are your communication skills? What are the various forms of communication that are effective? Should I email or text or call or those kinds of things in terms of networking? Another assignment in general that I've started incorporating into my classes is called I've Always Wondered, and that is a broad-ended, open-ended assignment where I challenge them to go explore something that they have always wondered about. So, for example, in my graduate human resource management class this spring, I challenged them something they've always wondered about managing people or leading people. And we had fabulous questions that people had always wondered about. And what they had to do was go find the literature. What does research say about this question? And then go interview or interact with practitioners. And what do they say about the issue? So again, not only did they learn something that was of interest to them, but they also had networking and being engaged in a community of practice to understand that, as well as their presentations to their own students, who then vicariously got to be part of that community of practice. A third thing that we continue to incorporate in many of our classrooms are short-term volunteer opportunities, where students are asked to go spend literally just 10 hours in the entire semester. This is realistic to most of their course loads. It's not overwhelming, but it gets them involved in a community of practice and gets them outside the walls of the classroom. And if they're good opportunities, usually there's some problem solving and some learning to do within the opportunity itself. And then finally, we've incorporated a number of opportunities for what we'll call field trips, which could be day-long, week-long visits and interactions with the community of practice, either in the native country or abroad, and then also full study abroad opportunities where students can go for 6 months or a year and interact with the community of practice. We have found, at least here at Texas A&M, that many of our students don't have access financially, and a lot of them are working to do a full-on 6-month, year-long study abroad. And so we have made field trips a lot more accessible, where we'll take them, for example, to, you see the picture here in China, and we've taken students to everywhere from the Dominican to Australia to Greece to Ireland, the UK, where they have an opportunity to get beyond their comfort zone. There's set knowledge where they're going to lectures and learning specific information about culture, but they're also learning a lot of tacit knowledge about things like navigating airports, navigating public transportation, navigating roommates and people that you get to spend more time with than you would have liked. So there's all kinds of learning opportunities there that are really pressed toward this idea of engaging in a community of practice. So those are some ideas to kind of wrap up in terms of application, and now we are more than happy to take on any questions that you would have for either of us.
Excellent. Thanks, Marlene, for giving us some of those sort of case studies and practical aspects related to that. So we had a question from Sally that came through early on, and I know you've touched on this a little bit, but it was related to the learner-centered aspect and how we might go about implementing that. And if you've got a class of, say, 45 students, that's not huge, how might we encourage them to respond? And what sort of tools and tips beyond what Emily provided with those questions, which was great, to encourage that to actually occur?
I missed the early part of that question. Could you condense? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, well, so looking at the learner-centered approach, I guess, have you got any other tips for how we can go about implementing that, particularly if there's a failure to respond by the students?
Well, you can always tie things to some sort of grade or some sort of evaluation. That's the natural default to things. But oftentimes, one of the things I've uncovered is they haven't really been modeled how to effectively respond to something or how to constructively criticize or question without being insulting. And so some of that is just a modeling or a set of examples that they can use to sort of draw upon, and they can sort of fill in their own blanks. One of the things that I have done to encourage questioning is that I have given out index cards to students at the beginning of a week or of a session of class, or a session of content, excuse me, and usually it's 3 depending on the size of the class. And what I say is that at some point in time during this class, this section of content, you have to turn in one of your cards, which is one of your questions. And so they can pick and choose when that actually is, and they can choose to use that card whenever they want, when they're more comfortable. But at the end of the period, everybody has to have used their three question cards. And I think I had minimal points tied into that, but it was one way that they could sort of feel safe in when they wanted to come forward and ask a question, but it encouraged a lot more robust discussion about things because they knew they all had to at some point.
I like that. I like that idea, Emily. That's cool. I would add just maybe a couple other ideas too. Early on in the semester, I have them at the end of the class, they might interact in small groups. So they begin engaging with each other before they have to share their reports to the before it's, one-on-one in front of the entire class. And again, this is pros and cons maybe, but sometimes in my graduate classes, they have assignments that are due prior to the lecture, and I incorporate some of their insights into the lecture itself, ones that I think make them look really smart. And so they get an opportunity to look good in front of their classmates without actually having to say anything in front of their classmates, which I find also gives them courage to do so.
Excellent, thank you very much. Now we have another question come through that relates to the communities of practice. Now it says that they like this approach, but students are also very pessimistic about the theories and applications in sport management reality as far as they know it. They have limited managerial competence of sport managers and things like that. How can we encourage students so that they remain optimistic?
That's a good question. I'm just thinking about application of theory, and a lot of times, at least in our graduate level classes, we try to build theory from practice in addition to building practice from theory. And so sometimes it's fun. Sometimes it's a really fun exercise where we'll talk about what have you seen in practice and why do you think this happens, and kind of the things that we do with theory, right? The who's involved, what's involved, and then why does this happen and how does it happen and how do we explain it? And we build what we think is a theory, and then sometimes I'll go back and find the theory that matches that. I don't always know, I don't know them off the top of my head exactly, but it's really interesting because a lot of times they have thought they came up with a new theory, and it's something that's very well explained in the literature. And so we come back and say, look, the theory thing isn't bunk. We're actually doing this and we don't even know it. And so and I think the other thing probably is to remain flexible and to understand that just because every part of the theory doesn't work, that doesn't mean the essence of it isn't. And to me, I frame that as encouragement that there's still so much to learn. That if you think, well, the essence of this theory works, but not in today's context, well, what's new? What are the boundary conditions? What needs to be extended? And how can you be part of extending the theory instead of just throwing it in the trash?
I have nothing to add. That was a fantastic answer.
Ashley, we're back to you.
Great, thanks for your response to those ones. Now, there's another kind of question here. Do you agree with this statement that the lecture should take no longer than 20 minutes, so to be still effective in that dual processing process? My experience is that it should be even less, maybe after 10 minutes, we need to switch to some sort of participatory mode. Do you have any thoughts on that particular concept?
My first reaction is it depends on what your lecture is and how it's being presented. If it's you standing up in front of a room with no visual PowerPoint or slides or prompts or anything else, yes, absolutely. The shorter the better. The short segments that you can do that then get to the interactive and the application and takes the focus off the top-down dissemination of knowledge, but the students' active engagement with it, absolutely. If you have well-crafted slides that naturally are designed to encourage conversation as the things progress, you will find that you may speak about a topic for 5 minutes on a slide that leads to a 15-minute discussion within the rest of the class. But again, if you have a very text-heavy slide that's essentially an outline of your chapter with key bullet points for them to remember, yes, A, try to avoid that slide to begin with, but B, as short as possible to get to the interaction and their activation with the content.
Yeah, I agree. And sometimes in finance we have really heavy information days, and I just add a cue. I just cue them at the beginning, and I really tell them, look, this is going to be information heavy. And if you'll stay with me today and we'll get through this, then we're going to apply it into our case study on Wednesday. But, you know, we really need to dig in here. And I really work with them through the lecture to take notes and to check learning. But sometimes cueing them too, if it's a long lecture day, is helpful.
Fantastic, those are great suggestions. Another question sort of says, what do you think about the latest trend, which seems to be the heavy use or reliance on YouTube videos?
My question about that is how they're being utilized. Are they being utilized in a flipped classroom sense that we're recording lectures ahead of time, there's some sort of readiness assessment that happens with some follow-up instruction, and then we've now saved that classroom time for active learning strategies and applications of knowledge and working on our case studies and working in our groups? I think that approach can be effective when students understand that that's the model you're going to utilize. But just doing those things to add more content, to free up classroom space to just add more content, doesn't seem to be an effective way to do things, because you're likely going to overload their system, because they're going to want and need the confirmation of what was presented in the YouTube video or in the flipped lecture that was accurate. I had questions before moving to the new stuff, and it's very difficult if they're two separate entities. But if they're used in conjunction and very much used effectively as complements to each other, then I think that can be effective so long as it's modeled and students understand what they're supposed to be doing with each of those tasks and the value of each of those tasks.
Yeah. I guess I don't use a ton of YouTube videos, but when I have found them to be effective is a lot of times in HR or in I taught social and culture aspects of sport a lot, and they can be really effective in introducing a topic that someone else can explain better than you can, and or to introduce a controversy that you don't want to position yourself as one way or the other. then you really want the students to own the debate. And so I've done that where here's a YouTube video. I'm not telling you what to think about this. You tell me what you think, and you all debate and interact. And so it brings into that something that I want to remove my own positionality out of the middle of that discussion. But I love what you said. It all depends. And there's no magic bullet of YouTubes or not YouTubes. They need to be integrated as part of a larger strategy.
Excellent. And then I know, Marlene, you gave an example previously about how you might set an assessment prior to class and incorporate some of the student responses into the session itself. Do you have any other examples for ways that we can incorporate student contribution into what might largely traditionally be seen to be that top-down approach where the lecturer presents the information to the students?
Yeah, I mean, I really like students to learn and present information, and I have worked hard at ways to do that that aren't just where you say, hey, you read you read this chapter, this group reads this chapter, this group reads this chapter, and they lecture to us, but more so integrated throughout the semester in many things like I've always wondered. That's a great way to bring in content, and then I supplement that with other leadership or HR issues that they cover it, and then I may cover it some more. So they teach, and then we also teach. And then again, the case studies are a great way, kind of in a flipped classroom where they're teaching each other and interacting with each other, where we may spend a whole day as a council to where, you know, we bring in these 5 consulting groups, which are the groups of students, and they debate their answers to the case study. That's a great way of integrating student expertise and student content without me being the expert disseminating information.
Another strategy that I have used is early on in the semester, I have students still fill out, you know, sort of information sheets about themselves. And within that, I'm asking them about what sports they follow, what things they like, you know, what pieces of the industry and their own experiences. And then I go back and revisit those when I'm actually preparing my class materials, because I know that some of the things I can prompt will be in somebody's wheelhouse that will give them an edge of, I know about this and I want to talk about this, and I can overcome maybe shyness, versus if I had examples from only one sport or only, you know, one country or only one perspective, they may feel unsure because they just don't have that knowledge. And so if I can get a baseline of what those things are, I do my best to incorporate some sort of easy ins for them into the content.
Great suggestions. And just being conscious of time, we've got one last question here from Eduardo, who says, any advice on the feedback professors could get about their classes from students after the course? Do you have any suggestions on the best format for going about doing that?
Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah.
Or I'll take it, whichever you want.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I like to ask for individual emails, and I like to ask questions such as, tell me something you learned in this class, or tell me 3 things you learned in this class, and tell me how you learned them. Tell me 3 ways that were effective for you for learning, and 3 ways that detracted from your learning. And then it centers on the learning and not on an attack or praise of me, which typically tends to be irrelevant.
And I would concur with that. I think we struggle with this, especially if we want to do true, you know, summative feedback. They're so close to the end and they're so close to being concerned about grades that oftentimes it's muddled or slightly colored based on some of those other factors. So I have actually in the past done more formative evaluations and informal things where it's a 1-minute paper, you know, one day that happens to be a reflection on classes, or it has to be, it's a reflection on, you know, we've been using these 5 active learning strategies, which one is great for you? And so I still have a chance in the moment to make changes for the remainder of the semester, but I'm catching them at a time when they're not so overwhelmed and concerned about other things that they might be afraid to be totally honest with those things. But the way Marlene has things phrased would help keep some of those personal attacks or personal considerations out of it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for your insights there. Now we've kind of come to the end of our webinar session now. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you've enjoyed hearing from our two guest presenters. I know that from some of the questions and things, we've already taken some great things away from today. Following this webinar, you'll receive an email seeking your feedback regarding today's webinar. We're keen to continue to deliver these in the future and would appreciate any feedback that you're able to provide. Also, if you're interested in leading a webinar, we'd also like to hear from you. Thanks again to Drs. Dixon and Dane-Staples for their presentation today, and thank you all for attending. If you do have any other follow-up questions, I would encourage you to contact both Marlene and Emily with any of those post-webinar. Thank you all for your participation today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.